we'll get this meeting going. So I call to order the meeting, and the first item is approval of the minutes of the September 10th meeting. I think Stacy has gotten a lot of good comments back. I think what we've got is all the input. Do we have any motions on this?
Move to approve.
We have a motion and a second on these minutes. Seeing none, all in favor? Judy.
I'm not sure if it was the 10th or the following minutes, but I believe Courtney Gavin read a statement at the end, and I don't think he's on the list in the back, with a list of other attendees. But I don't remember if it was that meeting or the next one.
We'll check on that.
I remember he did it.
We'll check on that, and if it needs to be added as an addendum to it.
It was the next meeting.
It was the next meeting.
It was the one, and then you have Kevin Gallagher and James Gallagher. It's Kevin Gallagher. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, you were fast.
Okay. All right. Then moving on, in terms of the minutes of our last meeting on September 24th, again, I think probably as this process moves forward, we'll most likely be kind of one set behind, because it takes time to do the rough draft of the minutes and then to get the input from everybody. So I think we're in the process of gathering the input and comments and suggestions on these minutes, so we won't be approving them today. We'll do that at the next meeting. All right? So with that, what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Stacy and to Mike, and take us on to a good 4 hours.
Great. We'll keep you fully awake and engaged. And sorry we're all missing the beautiful weather. As Dave said, I sent out the draft summary for September 24th. The September 10th one is now finalized, but I've already gotten a bunch of really good comments, so please keep sending me your comments, and I'll ask if you can get them to me by the end of the week. Any comments on the meeting 3 minutes, and I'll make those changes and have those finalized for next time. But I will walk through the action items from that meeting. We're still working on the updated project schedule, but in the meantime, what we do have for you is an updated meeting schedule, which I think at least gives you a sense of how none of the dates have changed. Or the times of the meetings. The only things that have changed are the order of the topics. So Mike will talk about that when he goes through again the pathway, reviews the pathway. And we're working on getting you the S-curve in visual form. We have a good draft of that. We're just tweaking it, and we'll have that for you soon. How many people were able to pick up copies of materials in advance here at Town Hall? Okay, so we'll continue doing that. I think what we might do is reduce the number that we have them do, because it's much more money for them to do it, bring it here, than for us to do it. So if we have, I think there were seven or 8 that were picked up, packets in advance. So if I just round up and call it 10, I think I'm going to just keep doing that. If you hadn't picked up this time and you want to have that be your practice in the future, let me know. We can up that number, but then I'll just bring packets for the rest on the day of. That's okay with people. Just making good use of your money. Okay, so we're still working on the nitrogen tracker tool, and we'll have that for next time. The water body information for the non-traditionals, I think you saw a lot of that updated in your tech memos and that went out for this meeting. So that's been done. And the freshwater ponds and phosphorus is being integrated into the traditional bookends, which we'll be discussing at the next meeting. So that was our action item. Also, there were some action items for all of you. Thank you for sending me comments on the meeting summary, which I finalized. I did compile the outreach ideas I got from people. I have gotten a few since then, and so we can talk about that as we get into that agenda topic. But I think those were really helpful. Those are helpful to give us a starting topic, and any additional comments people sent as well helped us as we prepared for this meeting. So that's the action items. Any question about action items? Yes.
Yeah, one of the action items for both meetings that said, make a PDF of the Microsoft project schematic available, and I haven't been able to find it. Is it on somewhere in the website now?
No.
Okay.
That still hasn't been done, which is why it's
Yeah.
been carried over as an action item.
We are,
Okay.
I'm working with Stan Tech.
All right.
We're
I just didn't know if
taking-
I was missing it someplace.
No,
Okay.
you haven't. It will be there by Friday, I promise. We have, trying to get this new schedule you'll see today with regard to the workshops integrated together, and there's been some changes and stuff as we've gone on, so.
And if you think it's frustrating for you, think about poor Stantec, whose project schedule keeps shifting on them. But that's the nature of this work. I think that's been the main thing, is that trying to make the project fit the feedback and as we progress, so.
Isn't that one of the principles of adaptive management?
It is. We're adapting as we go, even here in this process. I want to briefly review again the ground rules, being respectful, so turning off beeping devices, being on task. So we have a lot to cover today. I'm going to really work to keep, there's a lot of input we need from all of you, but it's got to be focused, and it's also really got to be concise, and it's got to be constructive. It's got to help move the ball forward. Okay, so those are our ground rules. I also want to apologize for having forgotten the name tags today. So to compensate, I think we should go around and you could just say your name. And while we're at it, maybe say one thing you like about fall in Orleans.
We all have the same.
First, Judy Scanlon and apples.
Suzanne Phillips, I like to be called Phil.
Bob Rich, I like the red maples at Cedar Pond.
Sims McGrath, Selectman, I like being able to make left turns.
Sid Snow, and I miss all the tourist customers.
Jeff Eagles, it's close to the White Mountains.
Sandy Bain, may I say that in Eastham? It's Boat Meadow. Just looking out there as the water they almost came over the bridge. It's really impressive.
Carol Ridley, and I love seeing the mist over the water.
At Daly, I just like October.
Judith Bruce, Return of the Ducks.
Dave Dunford, Selectman. No waiting lines at the restaurant.
Doug Fromm, The Length.
Jim McCauley, The Breezes.
Gordon Smith, Indian Summer. Joshua Larson, I no longer have to mow my lawn.
Dave Phillips, I'm enjoying the quiet.
Jenny Ianini Brewster, I can park at the Brewster store.
Sue Levin, I can get from Brewster to Orleans, in less than 45 minutes.
And Patty Daly, Cape Cod Commission, The Leaves.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. So the agenda for today, our main focus is on the non-traditional, updating the bookend on the non-traditional. And we will also take a little time before we do that. We'll get the roadmap again of where we are and where we're going from Mike, and we'll take a little time also to talk about the broader public engagement, public outreach. Julia, there's 2 different lists going around, so that one can stay for the group, and then we have, yeah, so I'll pass this one. Thank you. So we'll take a little time to talk about outreach and public engagement and how to make sure the great conversations and the great work that we're doing in here is really spread far and wide across the town and the neighboring towns as needed. So that's the agenda. Really, we'll look at the technology matrix, what's on that matrix that Orleans is considering, and the things that are on the matrix that are not being looked at in Orleans and why. A little bit of that. Look at the technologies themselves and SIA did an evaluation of those technologies in the abstract, in theory, but according to the evaluation criteria that you all had developed as a starting point, to just give a sense of where are these sort of falling, knowing that the detailed stuff is going to be on a site-specific level. So after the break, really getting into the site-specific, looking at some of the additional work that SIA did between the last meeting and now, and really ground truthing a little bit more some of these options in those places, and really getting your input on where to go from there. So that's the approach. We're going to, again, try to take comments from those very involved stakeholders and public members who aren't at the table as we go, though I tend to prioritize the table first, and we'll keep doing it that way as long as we can keep making that work. But we'll also take public comment if needed. Okay? Questions about the agenda?
Thank you, Stacy. One quick, as Stacy mentioned the name tags to me before the meeting, a remembrance came to mind that I thought I'd share with you as a little story. I went to a very strict military academy, and part of the process was in-ranks inspections every morning, stand at attention, et cetera. And I was brand new there, and you had to have your name tag on. It had to be straight, right place and everything. And this upperclassman comes up to me. We called him the Cat. He was meaner than Dickens. He looks at me, and I remembered I forgot my name tag, and he says, "Squat, where's your name tag?" And I was trembling, but it came to me. I looked at him, I said, "Sir, I memorized it and threw it away." And I did push-ups for the next week. Anyway, let's get serious. Couple of things. What I'd like to do is just go through, again, putting in context where we are. Starting with the nitrogen reductions, focused on nitrogen. We understand there's a lot of other things here but nitrogen. Started with the 208 plan scenarios. Our plan, basically the Orleans needs assessment we went through a few workshops ago, basically to take what we know about the needs, prioritize, see where we are in the certainty curve, which we'll talk about a little next time. We used the CWMP, we used other information. From that, we came up with a traditional plan and a non-traditional plan. We understand there are different levels of detail at this point. We'll fix that. We can't do everything at once, so we're going to step through this. From that, we'll get a modified traditional plan based on additional technical assessments, which are going on now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Gary's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. There'll be a non-traditional plan based on other types of technical assessments. So we're in that process now. In the meantime, the watershed tracker as a tool to kind of see where we are with regard to nitrogen, but also to see where we are with everything is on a sub-watershed level, not just the traditional and just nitrogen, but other things as well. And the financial model is coming along. We're working on that now and putting together that approach. From that, we'll be developing a hybrid plan, recognizing that we're at two extremes. A lot of change has taken place. We're going to put together a hybrid plan, continuing with technical assessments that will feed into that. We'll work on that hybrid plan as we go along, recognizing that, again, there's certain things we're certain of, certain things we know. We're going to know by then we should do. Other things are going to be questions. We need more data. We need more time. We're not certain how things work. That's where the adaptive management plan comes in. So as we've been talking along here, as those uncertainties become apparent, we'll move them to adaptive management. That doesn't mean we discard them. It means each one of those items in there has a plan for how to resolve it. Not just wishful thinking, but a specific plan. Last time at the end I presented some slides on the first thoughts, only thoughts about the adaptive plan, what it could look like. Those were just highlights. Those would need to be detailed. Each one of those bullets needs to be detailed, and a real approach to resolving that over the next months or years needs to be put into place. So that moves along as we develop the hybrid options. Colored is what we've done so far, moving fast, but trying to focus on the critical issues, not get stuck down in the details, and also not getting stuck in theory. One of the things we really want to emphasize here is that there's a lot of good work done with the 208, with other databases out there, but that's theory. What we want to do is move along this to a hybrid approach, and even the traditional and non-traditional approaches that are grounded in Orleans, in the streets, in the estuaries, in the yards, at the plant, et cetera, of Orleans. So we're talking about not theoretical removal efficiencies or locations, but actual stuff in Orleans. So we're moving somewhat fast here. That's one of the reasons. Today we're going to look at technical assessments for the non-traditional technologies, and Sia will talk through a modified plan for your comment, your thinking, your feedback on it. Again, it's not the end. This is still one of the pieces we're moving along. We're going to have plenty more time with this to optimize it. As we've done that, we've taken a look at, as Stacy said, about the structure of the workshops. We've done 3. Today we're doing workshop 4. We're looking at those 2 things. Workshop 5, as you see in the new list of subjects, we're going to look at heavily back on the traditional. Stantec's been doing a lot of work. There's a lot of moving parts to that are coming together. Those will come together. We'll focus on the traditional, and we're going to focus on an approach, the financial approach. The inputs, outputs, and the methodology for the financial approach. That'll be a key part. It's not, most of it will be on the traditional technologies next workshop. The one after that, we're going to do dive down into adaptive management. Stantec has been looking at this. We've been talking about it, but what is it? How does it work? What's the theory, but also the practice of it as we move through this? What is adaptive management, and how does it apply to our particular watersheds, sub-watersheds, technologies, monitoring, and everything else? That's workshop 6. Then with 7, we're going to come back and look at, that's going to be a technical workshop. That's on December 3rd, I believe. Get into some of the technical details that we need to cover before we go into a hybrid plan. Different options at the plant, step-steg criteria, and more definitive results on the septage study, anaerobic digestion, food waste, and how that affects the plant and the plant site and stuff like that, and what are the financial opportunities there as well. Then 8, workshop 8, the fun will begin, if you're not already having fun, with development of the hybrid plan. We're going to talk, as I said, about it at meeting 6, about the overall approach. Workshop 8, we're going to be putting our heads together, coming up with the hybrid plan. We're thinking now about what kind of straw men, and you may have some thoughts on this as we do the approach, hybrid option approach at meeting 6. You may have some options on that. Do you want straw men, or do you want to be really creative yourself? And where in between do we want to be? Stantec's ready to go either direction, and there's a lot of questions that come up there as to how to develop that. So that's what we'll be talking about. And then we'll go through workshops. I have 14 on here. I'm not sure it will be 14, maybe more, maybe less, but that'll become clear as we start honing in on specific solutions and specific issues and optimization of that hybrid plan. So, questions or comments or thoughts on that? Ed?
Yeah, I like your plan. I do have a concern, though. Up there it says Orleans needs assessment in that center box there. And I think that, as a designer, since we've been tasked to really design a plan that we will find consensus on. This, as a designer, is, to me, the most important block, because it said, what are the requirements that you're designing the system for? We've got a lot of engineers in the crowd, and I think everybody appreciates that. And what we were given was a document that was called the Orleans Needs Assessment Summary.
Yeah.
It wasn't a needs assessment. It was and I congratulate Stantec for doing a great job going through all those documents and summarizing. I think they did a fine job. But we don't have a needs assessment. What we have, and this whole, all the documents in there, almost every one of them, was based on the MEP reports. Now, we know the data that was collected for MEP reports between 2001 and 2005 is now obsolete. The inlets have changed the tidal prisms, they've changed the water quality both in Pleasant Bay and Town Cove. So that's just because of the dynamic nature of the inlets. And as a matter of fact, last week in the minutes, Brian Dudley said that clarified the MEP is not static. The hydrodynamic conditions have changed since the original report, and appropriate models should be developed to account for these changes and to develop the best solutions for the current conditions. Well, we don't have that yet, but we are required to come up with a design based on data which is not only obsolete, it's incorrect. And it starts off in 208, and the CWMP does the same thing. They start off with the TMDLs, which is all based on obsolete and incorrect data as of right now.
Yeah.
So that's a question I really have, is how do we wrestle with that as designers? Because we have to be honest with the people that we bring this plan to. Somebody's going to ask, what did you base it all on? And if we tell them we based it on obsolete and incorrect data, I think there's going to be a problem.
Right.
So anyway, I know it's a problem,
That's not
an issue.
That's not a yes/no answer question.
Okay.
However, some comments. No model has ever been developed, especially one as complex as the MEP, where you start with rainfall, you take it through groundwater, you put it into an estuary, you mix it around, and you do, eutrophication, et cetera. No model is perfect. Every model is inaccurate to some degree. However, that is the best tool we have, and it is a valid tool. How accurate it is, how big that envelope is the question. And you're right, there's been hydrodynamic changes, physical changes, et cetera, that will govern the main part of Pleasant Bay especially, and probably part of Nauset Marsh. We don't know how much yet. That's why it's in the adaptive thing, the adaptive line. That's why last week at the end we had 2 slides on the main part of Pleasant Bay and Nauset Marsh, because there's uncertainty there. And you're right, the MEP model is dynamic. It's always new data. The day after you take data, there's new data. So, however, we have to work with that. So it's in adaptive management, but there's a lot of things we do know. That's why we did the certainty curve. We do know that the terminal ponds are stressed. We do know if there's serious conditions there. We do know in Mill Pond and Town Cove we have serious issues. We do know we have downtown. When you say there's not data, the CWMP went through pretty detailed studies on 5 categories of needs, including failed septic tanks and tight tanks, groundwater protection, water supply protection, nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't think, and I don't think, as part of this process, number one, we need to replicate that, check it, or produce a new needs survey. That's going backwards 10 years. We do have things we need to work on, serious things we need to fix. But we're not to go back and do that. The intent here was to take what we know and move forward. We don't have time or money, or I don't think we really have the need to do that for some of the clear things. So that's the framework we're working under.
Well, I agree that that's all we have right now is what the MEP did. And I'm not questioning the model. The model has been peer-reviewed by
The MEP and the CWMP.
Yeah, and it's been reviewed. All I'm saying is the data upon which they were based. Nothing, I'm not questioning the model or anything. I'm just saying the data upon which it's based is obsolete and incorrect now. But we have lots more data that we could bring to this audience and show you what's happened in the last 10 years. Which,
Fantastic. That's great. And that is part of the adaptive approach. When we put that in there, it will include data from various sources, a number of different sources. That's fine.
Okay.
It may need to be linked. There may be gaps. There may be different other data that's needed. It may need to be compatible with different. That's okay. That's part of a picture, part of the puzzle that we need to put in place. The other thing is, we're not going to resolve, there was never an intent in this 6 to 9 month, 8 month period, depending upon when we started, to resolve all these issues. We're not going to resolve them here. We don't have new MEP studies being done. We don't have comprehensive data collection programs going on. So we're not going to resolve them. We have to distinguish between what we know and what we don't know.
I think all we're looking for is, you're absolutely right, I agree with you, but if you propose a system like this in industry, what you do is assess the risk. What is the risk? And bound the risk so the technical risk can be turned over to the financial people and they can assess how to cover the risk.
That's
so
right.
that when presented to the people,
Yeah.
they will know that we've considered
We absolutely
risk.
need to discover risk. SIA is going to start to talk about that today. There are probably a dozen different categories of risk, from financial to technical to all implementation, all kinds of stuff like that. Let's leave that, though, at this point here.
Yeah,
Someone
no,
else had his...
Can I just jump in? Because I just am worried about where this conversation can go on, and we've had it before, and I don't want us to have it now. So I don't want us to have it now. We need to talk more about adaptive management, how we are fitting in ongoing uncertainty, risk, even, let's name to some extent, disagreements about data and facts. How we are managing all of that using adaptive management, we are going to get there. We're going to have a meeting where we really focus in on that. This isn't that meeting, so it can't be part of every meeting, and it's not going to be more part of this meeting. I'm not going to take more comments on this. So we got to move on. We got to move on. Hold that one.
Well, Mike said last time that we're going to do a sensitivity analysis.
Yep, and it's
that's
in the
part-
adaptive
that's part of
management,
this.
and we're going to talk about it, but it's not happening today. That's not part of today.
Understand that.
Okay?
There's a sensitivity analysis going on. You see it right now.
But that addresses this.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a key part of it.
So that whole, the S curve, the list of adaptive management topics, directions, things we all need to do, all of that we're going to get to, we'll get back to, but we're not going to go there now.
Yeah, okay. Paul, different subject completely?
Yes. In the interview, someone at Stantec mentioned that they had done a food waste study for Dennis or Yarmouth or something. Can we get that? Because you mentioned we're going to talk about that relative to
Yeah.
Tri-Town, and it would be useful to have that information. I assume
Okay,
it's a
we'll
public
put that
document.
on the list. We'll start accumulating stuff for that. We'll probably put a separate little tab on the website for that. Okay. Okay, one other little item that was supposed to take 10 minutes, or 5. This is supposed to take 5. So, there's been discussion about stormwater management, both from the 208 side and sort of stormwater and fertilizer credits, and then from a water quality side, what needs to be done about stormwater, is it cost effective, et cetera. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been doing some work with the town to understand what the town has done and is doing and will be doing going forward. And these slides are intended to give sort of a framework for that. Not details, but framework. Just high level, the town has budgeted, and you guys probably all know this much better than I do. A lot of you are engaged in the task forces and committees that are overseeing this. So this is more to make sure we're all on the same footing with stormwater and give us a perspective. The town's budgeted $500,000 for stormwater master plan. It also budgets $150,000 per year for stormwater capital improvements. There's a lot going on. There's been a lot being done. 2013, There was a stormwater aerial flight, and that produced GIS mapping of stormwater infrastructure points. What that means is that from the aerials, you could designate manholes, storm drain inlets, outfalls if they're visible, et cetera, and it gave us that initial reference. GHD did a stormwater facilities inventory that's on an FTP site that basically took that, went through pipe alignments, grades, sizes, and preliminary flows. It also looked at prioritization and initial assessment of the end contribution from these little drainage areas. It had a little module that could look and say, okay, for this drainage area, you're going to get about this much flow and about this much nitrogen, phosphorus contribution. Now, in 2014, AMEC consulting firm is doing a stormwater impact and alternatives assessment. They have a model for developing pollutant loads more accurately and testing them against BMPs, best management practices, for control of those pollutants. It's more quality focused. The BMP it's also looking at BMP effectiveness, costs, application to priority outfalls, and developing a water quality database for stormwater. Also, concurrently, Green Seal Environmental is taking the information from these studies and updating the town's GIS database so it includes all of this on one database. There's been a lot going on. What do we need to do going forward? There is a town website now set up in the last week or two or so that is for stormwater management. So the studies and work being done here is being put on that folder or that page in the town website. We need to integrate the components of the stormwater program. All of them, it's like, again, a big mosaic. We have pieces here, pieces here, pieces. There may be gaps here. There may be a little bit of overlap. We need to put them all together into an integrated database and understanding of that, including mapping and information. There's some piloting going on, consideration of pilot BMPs, Uncle Israel's Pond pilot, or possibly another. The cost effectiveness of that is marginal. It's very hard to get some of these pollutants out of stormwater. It can be very expensive. There's ways, but that's being looked at now through piloting in certain locations to be determined. All of this needs to be linked to what we're doing here in terms of a revised CWMP. How does what the stormwater package is doing, the town is doing there, fit into what we're doing? It takes a lot of the burden off the work we need to do, but it still needs to be integrated with the various nitrogen and other phosphorus and other components here.
How much of any of this has to do with nutrient line?
Well, quite a bit. The GHD study started to look at nutrients. The AMEC project looks at nutrients with regard to BMPs and pollutant loads. The model actually develops nitrogen, phosphorus pollutant loads to these little outfalls, to each of the outfalls. They're prioritizing. It also prioritizes and says, you know, there's a lot of inlets and a lot of stormwater outfalls in town, so it prioritizes the largest and the most sensitive.
The BMPs, are those the state stormwater BMPs, or to what extent do the BMPs actually establish nitrogen reduction standards?
Good question. I don't know.
Get to that.
What's that?
I'm going to get to that.
Yeah. Okay.
Mike, both the bookends indicate that there's a general note, there's a 25% nitrogen reduction from fertilizer and stormwater management. At Paul Zwickie's 208 presentation in Chatham 2 weeks ago, he made a comment that indicated, it led some of us to think that we might be not interpreting that correctly. Are we all on the same page that this is the right number? And this may be an issue it's an issue we've touched on before, so Stacy, you may want to shut down this conversation. Feel free.
Well, you could just let Patty answer.
Sure. What Paul clarified was that we're talking about in 208 taking 25% of the stormwater contribution load as well as 25% of the fertilizer load in the 208 scenarios that are being put together. So I think there was some confusion. We were talking about taking 25% off the top, but we weren't. We were talking about 25% of fertilizer and stormwater, respectively.
I agree, that is what he said. My question is that how we've used that on these numbers?
No, and see, it can explain this in more detail. I'll give you we're not going to use that. We have detailed fertilizer studies. We have stormwater information. So that's a rule of thumb that the 208 put in place Cape-wide. We're going to have better information than that. So with regard to the amount of stormwater plus the percent reduction, we'll be tailoring that to Orleans based on what assumptions they made.
I'm
Now,
asking
before we go on here, I have 5 minutes. I've used 8. So,
Well, Mike, I just want to clarify that last statement, because on the figures here, there's a general notes that refer to this 25% reduction on the figures.
Yeah.
So
what is that figure?
this is the figure of the Orleans initial non-traditional bookend
And Carol, that's exactly right. What I'm saying is future. Right, when those were done, we were coming off the 208.
Okay.
We hadn't looked at this, we still haven't looked at this stormwater in detail. We're still updating the fertilizer study update's going to be done over the next few weeks. We'll have better fertilizer data, and those numbers there that are placeholders from the 208 are going to be modified based on our site-specific
But
information.
just to be clear, right, so everyone understands, the 25, we're always, whether the 208 or here, when we are saying 25%, we mean from those contributions, not off the top. It's never off the top, right? Is that? And so we're going to hone that number here, but it's still from the contribution. Clarifying contribution, clarifying percentage that you can reduce of that contribution.
And we're going to be able to be more specific on the contribution,
Right.
plus the 25% of that contribution. So
if we can move on, just because of time, Crescent?
Yeah. Are these based on models or calculations, or has somebody gone around in Orleans and specifically measured the concentrations and the volume flows in the stormwater drains? Because the first flush actually carries most of the pollutants.
Yeah.
So what level are you talking about when you talk about?
It's a combination of both. There has been some ground truthing there with actual sampling at outfalls. There also is extrapolation of that to a lot of the other outfalls. That's pretty much always the case. If you wanted a monitoring program to measure out the quality of outfalls from storm drains, extremely expensive. And by the way, since the 1980s, there's a certain norm, a bell curve, from the National Urban Runoff Program, NERP, back in the 80s, that basically defines the range of contributions.
I'm okay.
Okay.
And Sia will say when she will talk a little bit more about stormwater, so we'll
Yeah.
get back. Don't worry.
It's not rocket science, you know. It's okay. We need to determine the credit for nitrogen removal. Based on this information for nitrogen and fertilizer, determine the credit, define cost effectiveness priorities and approaches. Cost effectiveness is a huge issue here. Stormwater is not a huge percent of the total load, nor is nitrogen or phosphorus in that stormwater a huge percent of the total load there either. So we have to prioritize and focus and get the right approaches, develop an overall implementation plan for stormwater management and fertilizer. Fertilizer's further ahead, it needs to be fine-tuned, in conjunction with water quality management plan, with what we put out. So the two are linked together, and our program for the revised CWMP includes the stormwater component that's consistent with it and has the right water quality goals, and costs are included as well. So, questions? Thank you.
Before we go there, sorry, before we go there, though, we are going to talk about outreach and public engagement. So before we go into the next piece, so I handed out outreach ideas that I got from panel members. This is not very highly edited, so this is pretty much, suggestions directly from you all, and a few that we got afterward that I'm going to add to this list for you all now. One of them was including milestones or public events that you, the stakeholders, both the stakeholders and the liaisons on the panel, will commit to doing with your constituents directly, right? So that is maybe this suggestion, again, was maybe once a quarter, you agree to put it on your committee or commission or organization's agenda and do that update with them, something like that. So that was another suggestion. Another suggestion that was added was perhaps the group wants to do an information sheet for the fall town meeting. Just a one-pager, again, just an idea that someone put out there. I could say we would be willing to help draft that, get everybody's input, and try and come up with something everybody felt like was an accurate description of where we were, what we were doing, et cetera. And it could be a product of the panel as a whole. And then a third additional suggestion to add to this list was interactive public workshop, so to actually hold a public event where we really give the public a chance to dig into where we are. I think the suggestion was maybe winter, early spring, when we're a little further along and we have things for them to dig into. But that's one more to add to this list. So adding those three and looking at the others we have on here, what are people's thoughts?
No, just quick, I like the idea of the one-pager for the town meeting. I think that makes an awful lot of sense. I think that can be a very good forum to at least be disseminating, and obviously we're going to be bringing an article to fund a couple of the additional small studies that we've got going on some of the non-traditional approaches or the fertilizer study. So I think it makes an awful lot of sense. It's a great forum for it. But we have a short time frame for it.
Yeah.
I really think all of these are great ideas, and we can achieve all of them. I think that's great. I know I'm representing the business community, so we've already setting up monthly meetings to be able to disseminate the information I'm gathering here from everybody to inform them and come back with concerns that they have.
I'm thinking that we're talking watersheds, and it's very hard for all of us, even us, to envision watersheds. And so that a walking tour, watershed by watershed, of the people, of the solutions being proposed for that watershed, and what is the watershed, would be I think, very helpful to the public.
Other thoughts?
I think it's important that we show that we're going through a thorough process in arriving at whatever we arrive at. And I don't think we should wait too long to do that. I think if we know, say in November, that we've achieved certain consensus generally, I think we should report that. And then give people the confidence that we're taking a logical building block approach.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think the interactive workshop is very important. I think people really appreciate it, and that's how they learn best. I wouldn't wait until winter to do that. I mean, even though we may not have all the answers, we may have very few answers. I think it's very important to have an opportunity for the public to come in and interact early on.
I think that to reach the most people, you might want to have a monthly update if the media will support it in the Cape Codder and in the Cape Cod Times, in the Orleans area section, or Eastham, Orleans, Brewster. Just some brief update, bullets, something that people can look forward to seeing on a routine basis, because that's going to reach many people.
The question is, who does this? And the first bullet makes reference to a subcommittee. Is this perhaps an area where a subcommittee that you spoke of early in the process could be set up to bring back to the full group the ideas and the actions to begin educating the public?
Just a note of caution, at some point the question of how much is it all going to cost is going to come up. And until the financial modeling team and all of us have a very high degree of certainty based on the model that we're developing about how much it's going to cost, I think advancing that, any specific figures should be avoided at all costs.
Good note. Yeah.
I think you develop a panel, a group that's going to do a strategic plan on how you're really going to get this information out. And my opinion is you start small and then build on that. Just let them know that we're working on 2 different models and we're going to put them together and let that grow. But get it out there frequently.
I think many of us prepare summaries for our own organization of what's going on. It might be useful to kind of put a link page of summaries or points, links to articles in the papers and whatever, so we have some place to go to highlight all of these different summaries.
So
Your
right now we
minutes are
have the
great there.
website where all the materials go, but you're saying that maybe on this website we could also have a link, or a section that has all the press about it.
Your minutes are great, but they're a little dry.
I'll throw in some jokes next time. Yeah,
Executive summary type,
Yes.
so that we can link
Yes.
to it.
yeah. So, a couple questions then, on things that people seem to be picking up on here. Monthly updates. This is something we could probably put together as executive summary type thing coming out of the process. We could draft it, we could send it for comments to you all, because it needs to be a panel product, not just me and Mike out on a limb, right? At the same time, we want to avoid having to wordsmith in too much detail, but I think we can pull that off if we keep this short enough. So that's something we could offer to do, and to talk to the newspapers about what the deadlines are and how to make sure they're in them. They could go into the newspapers. They could also, though, go into your newsletters. Because one of the ground rules is to not have each of you giving your own interpretation of the process out in the public, to actually try to speak with one voice about the process. It's one thing for you to talk to people about their interests or concerns or your opinions, but in terms of describing what's happening, what we're doing here together, it's really best that we have sort of a common voice. So that could serve that function as well. Do people like that idea?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, particularly, and on a specific, it's been indicated to me that I think Cape Cod has already committed to giving us space.
Okay.
If we so wish it, maybe even as often as every 2 weeks, but that's a lot. Once a month, a column along what you're talking about that's perhaps bylined by the advisory panel, not an individual, but by the advisory panel. And an update, I think, is very effective.
Okay, great. Yes.
I'm trying to think of how this would work for Eastham and Brewster. We have been reporting to the Eastham Selectmen on a monthly basis, and basically not giving them everything, because they can't handle everything. I can't handle everything. But trying to pull out what's particularly relevant to Eastham and questions that Eastham needs to answer. So I don't know if that fits the model you're talking about.
Okay, well, let's talk a little more about if there's a way to have the Eastham and Brewster editions, or something like that. And maybe there's a way we can make sure, for example, if we have sort of a outline of what we're putting in these monthly things, and one bullet in the outline is about Eastham and Brewster or cooperation across town lines, right? And so then at least it's making sure to touch on those issues. The other thing people seem to like is the fall town meeting. It seems like if we're doing this monthly, that's good, and then we might have something that sort of is particularly appropriate as an update for town meeting, because it might go even further. I want to ask about your job updating your own constituencies, and it is kind of built into the ground rules that this is what you do, but we didn't set anything like you must do it every X period of time. But is this something people are doing? Are your boards and committees and constituents asking for this? Is that role happening?
They're getting it.
And so for those who it's happening, that's terrific. For those who it's not happening, we want to help you make sure that it happens. So I think let's not talk about it necessarily here. Maybe these monthly updates will help you make sure that happens. And especially if you can use them as a trigger for dialogue. So that is, get their questions, get their input, and make sure that helps inform you here and helps them make sure they really do feel like they have a voice and they are participating in this process.
I think the monthly updates will be very helpful for my committee. I've hesitated to really discuss the work of this group for fear of putting out my own personal views. So I like the idea of a monthly update, which I could use on the Water and Sewer Commission.
Has thought been given to disseminating the approved minutes to the constituent bodies?
I mean, they're on the websites. So they're publicly available, and we'd love them to be dry as they may be. We would love them to be spread far and wide. And, we do put a fair amount of thought into how to walk that line between concise but not missing detail that's important. And if you have input on that, just how well we're doing that job, can we get it shorter? Are we missing stuff? Any of that feedback's also really welcome whenever you give us feedback on the minutes. But yes, I think that would be terrific. If people, at the very least, let people know the website's there, all the materials are there, they can go and they can read all of this stuff. The links, if they want to watch the meetings, they can do all that too, right?
But as part of using the outreach side of this discussion, if, as an organization, as a panel, as the disseminator of the information and consensus builder at the head of the room, perhaps doing the outreach, sending it to whatever contact points we have within each organization, is just being a little bit more proactive and making sure that we're disseminating to whatever degree we can. It's the only reason I brought it up.
Yeah, that's great.
We do pass along the excellent minutes that come out of these meetings, and perhaps if we could also have a 1 or maybe 2-page summary of the critical information within that for those that aren't going to read.
That'll be the monthly. Right?
That'll be very helpful.
We're keeping up with that, so if we can do that monthly, and then we'll have our meeting minutes that are a little more detailed. If that works for people, I think we can add that up.
There are people in town that do not have a computer. There are people that actually don't have TVs. You might want to keep a copy of the minutes at the library, town library. Maybe also a location here at Town Hall where people could come in and read the materials if they needed to do so.
Stacy, I thought the minutes were very good.
I'm going to just throw in a joke and see if you guys catch it. Anything else? Oh, the workshop. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about a workshop. It sounds like people like the idea of a public workshop. There's a question about when we would want it, when is really the right time to do that. If it's early, then what we'd be really presenting is our process and how we're going about this, and maybe our bookends, right, if we were to do this anytime soon. Maybe a good time is after we've done the first round of hybrid planning together. Maybe that's a good time after we've vetted a first hybrid plan with all of you, gotten your input, to then bring that to the public and try and do a public workshop at that time. What do people think?
I agree with doing the public workshop a little later, because even here, with highly motivated people that are reading everything, we still end up in the discussions having questions. Oh, what about blah, blah, blah that's going to be down the road? And I think that would happen even more so with the general public. So let's do a little more work, and then we'll be more ready to answer their questions.
I'm just thinking that in our process, we're going to be targeting a summarization of all this for the 2 boards of selectmen in ECO and Brewster at a tri-town meeting. And we're initially targeting that for the first or the second Thursday, I believe, in November. And I don't know what the output of that will be, and I think it may be very useful to, we can see that, make a judgment whether that's appropriate work that would be great to bring to the general public at that point, or whether there are still some questions that need to be done. But work is going to have to be done for that meeting, and so we don't have duplicate, I guess is my question.
Could that meeting be open to the public and advertised so that it could serve both the function of educating and getting input from the boards of selectmen as well as allowing the public to come?
Well, I think it's an open meeting, so they're clearly open to the public. I don't know where it's going to be yet. And if it's going to have 500 people, which I doubt, but if it has a large audience, then that will probably dictate where it might influence where it's going to be. But I don't think it's been decided yet where it's going to be.
Well, it's also possible to think about piggybacking, where it may be important to have sufficient meeting time just for the boards of selectmen and the city wants for them to talk about, but it may then be immediately following, the public are all invited to that part, but then immediately following, it's more of an open.
So I just don't think it's a one or the other, early or late. I'm really advocating for two because I think it's very important that the public understand the process, how we're getting there, where we're starting, and then more of a finished product. I'm concerned that if we wait until we've got something in hand, people aren't going to understand how we got there, they're not going to buy into it, and they aren't going to feel like they had any kind of part in this process.
Plus, the other thing there is that the issues and concepts and approach, you don't get in one meeting. It's going to take at least.
You don't get it in four.
Yeah, right.
Jeff, and then Sam.
Yeah, I agree with something for the October town meeting, but we ought to be thinking about how do we do communicating the run-up to the May town meeting, because that's where things are really going to get interesting. What series of things do we want to communicate leading up to that will help that process?
Yeah. A question about the town meeting then and the workshops. So I have in other processes in the past come to a town meeting in mid-process, or the panel, representatives of the panel have actually stood up at the town meeting and done as sort of committee review, a committee update. Here's what the panel's up to, here's our process, and actually giving a presentation. It's not interactive, but at least it's more than just a piece of paper that gives an overview. It's actually a 5 or 10 minute presentation. Do people think, is that something you guys do at your town meetings?
Not very often. I mean, we're always open to thoughts and suggestions, but that's something that isn't done very often. And I think our moderator is somewhere on the right track, but he really kind of discourages some of those things.
Yeah. I think by doing some outreach, doing some a one-pager for the town meeting, some work with the media outlets will help establish some of the background. With regard to the November meeting of the 3 boards of selectmen, that's sort of a micro to the hybrid plan's macro. And so I think both are in order. And I think the timing for the macro is what's really important for the public consumption. And I think timing is less important than the completeness of the theoretical hybrid plan that we've discussed here. So I think that we really have 3 elements. We do the idea of some sort of background work. I think that can be done without a public meeting. The questions on that could come to a public meeting, but let's not do 101 at the public meeting. I think the public is reasonably well informed, and if we can give them some background, then we've brought them up to speed on the foundation for our efforts.
Okay, so we'll try and do a little synthesizing of those thoughts about the workshop and come back to you with that. But I think for now we can safely say a commitment to create a monthly executive summary and and a fact sheet for town meeting, and to get those monthly updates in the local newspapers, and that you all are gonna get them to your constituents, potentially also gonna be sending your constituents the whole meeting summaries, and links to the website. But at the very least, making sure you're using those monthly updates to update your constituents and solicit any input or feedback from them. We can also work on getting copies, hard copies of things at the library and at town hall. I think some of these other things we can talk more about and think a little bit more about, walking tours, going to set up tables at events and things like that, all merit further thought and discussion. So we won't take this off. We're not done with this topic completely, but we've made some progress. People feel okay about that? Okay. Now, Gary. I will let you-
Thank you, folks, and good afternoon. Before Sia jumps into her dog and pony show, very entertaining, I've seen a preview. What I wanted to do, Mike has given all of you an idea of where we all are in the process. What I want to do is bring you up to date very briefly on some of the other things we're working on that you will begin to see over the next couple of meetings. We've got a septic and food waste market study that is one of our scope items. Our team has completed surveys of telephone surveys of wastewater treatment facilities and haulers. So we have information from them that we're compiling now on volumes of material, on cost to dispose, on cost to treat at the wastewater plant. So that's all critical info that we can use to complete our study. And again, over the next two workshops with this group, you'll be seeing the results of that study. The next item I wanted to talk about is the alternate disposal sites. There was some work done, a significant amount of work done in the CWMP. A list was put together. Some criteria was evaluated for particular sites. We have done we've had a meeting with George Reservi, who has helped us to ground truth that information. We've added some sites, we've taken some sites off. We've added some criteria. Basically, we're looking at size of the sites, undeveloped, looking at groundwater in the area, looking at things like wetlands nearby, maybe if it shows up on a natural heritage and endangered species program map, that would be a vote against the site. And understanding ownership. If it's town-owned site, obviously that's preferred. So those are the things that we're evaluating. We've got a number of sites that look favorable relative to that criteria. And again, over the next two workshops, you will get the details of that information. We're working on tri-town options. There's looking at conceptually looking at configuration of treatment facilities there. Looking at how do you provide new facilities and keep the existing facility operating at the same time? Do you demolish? So those are things that we're looking at there. Another thing we're looking at is reuse water. It's a concept that has merit, and we're putting together an evaluation of how a reuse water system might be laid out in the town of Orleans, what sites are available to receive and take advantage of that treated wastewater. Again, that's going to be information that is shared in the next couple of meetings. Lastly, regarding our the traditional bookend, it's going to be the primary focus of the next meeting. The last version that was shared with you was basically the layout as we understood it from the Cape Cod Commission. We have moved that the progress on that particular item significantly down the road, so we've got lots to share. It's we're trying to, we're actually going to use a very similar method of conveying that information to you that SIA has, where we've got graphical information and a step-by-step approach, helping people understand that nitrogen is being addressed sub-watershed by sub-watershed. I think it makes sense to get into that level of detail. So that's what I have for update on other things that are happening. Yes.
Yes. Is deep injection well disposal being considered for treated wastewater?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Anything else? No? Okay. Sia, you're on. Do you need help with that, or you're good?
So just on the schedule, I'm going to talk for about an hour. We're going to talk about the technology matrix and how we got to the technologies we're using in our modified non-traditional bookend, and then talk a little bit about a context for this process. We're going to go through each technology. I have a few slides for each one, and then we're going to get your feedback, and then we're going to take a break. And when we come back from the break, we're going to discuss each of the sub-watersheds that I presented at the last meeting and go through, we've got printouts and a slide for each of those sub-waters with the non-traditional technologies and try to get your feedback and see where they end up at the end of today. And so with that, wanted to start out and say that the technology matrix was a Herculean effort to synthesize a lot of information on what are non-traditional technologies, which are there's a laundry list. There's an arm's length of different technologies. And I think when the commission went looking, they were actually looking for something that already existed, something that compiled things from eco-toilets and coastal habitat restoration into one place with all of the available information. And because that didn't exist, they actually put it together. And it's a tool, but it is a database, which means it's a dynamic listing with very extensive bibliography for what the technologies are, what literature has been published on these different technologies, and what is known pretty much nationally, but in some cases there's some international references for different technologies. That whole process was vetted through a panel of experts, so people who spend their professional life looking at these different technologies. So what we've got in the technology matrix is a great resource. And in that resource is a range of cost information and a range of nitrogen removal information. It didn't focus on phosphorus so much, but there are some numbers about phosphorus as well. One of the things that I think it's very important for us for me to say about the technology matrix is that it is optimistic. From a technical perspective, I actually have no doubt that you can install these non-traditional technologies and they will work. But the real question is, how well do they work? And there's a range for each of the technologies in the matrix of one level of performance and another level. And what we need to do to bring that from maybe 10,000 feet down to ground level is understand from a real world implementation perspective, what do we get? What do we really see? And there's also, in the matrix, this question of what is public acceptance? How do people feel about aquaculture? How do people feel about eco-toilets? So those two issues I wanted to highlight, and so the technology matrix is a really important baseline that we're going to go through, and we're doing this today. This is not something we're doing a different day. We're going to talk about how you get from general to very specific. A number of the technologies that are in the matrix show up in the Orleans non-traditional bookend. And this is the list. It's aquaculture, coastal habitat restoration, eco-toilets, floating constructed wetlands, fertigation, innovative alternative septic systems, inlet maintenance, not inlet dredging, but maintenance, land use controls, and permeable reactive barriers. And with this list, you can see why we all want to use acronyms. These are big, long words. We want to say FCW for floating constructed wetlands. And so what I'm giving you here, I'm saying the words so that we can all learn the nomenclature. It's a vocabulary. These are a set of vocabulary words. And at the end, there will be a quiz. We're using those. You got that, good. We're going to use these for our non-traditional bookends, and there are a few that are in the technology matrix that we're not going to use, and those are the ones that are not black. So we've got the third one down is phytoirrigation, and then there's phytoremediation, there's pond and estuary dredging, and there's surface water remediation wetlands. And those are not being brought forward right now in the non-traditional because, frankly, I couldn't locate specific pieces of land where it made sense. The depth to groundwater is a very particular criteria for the phytoirrigation and the phytoremediation and the surface water remediation. And the 208 plan didn't identify specific sites where that made sense, and my review further didn't identify sites either, so they aren't part of the solution. Where pond and estuary dredging are not part of the solution is because we have an area of critical environmental concern, and dredging is off the table. We are looking maybe for maintenance, and we're going to talk about that later, but the idea of dredging and inlet widening, not on the table. The constructed wetlands are on the table as part of the traditional solutions as a discharge. So we are not, what you would do with constructed wetlands is have a discharge of wastewater or groundwater and put them on the wetlands as kind of a polishing step for additional treatment. But that's not part of the non-traditional solution. So we're not talking about taking water out of the ground and putting it on constructed wetlands. Does that make sense? Okay. The other one is chemical treatment of ponds and pond and estuary circulators. Those are being considered. We want to talk about those as potential options for the freshwater ponds. And so, again, the technology matrix had a long list. We're using these. We are using some of these. We're going to explore some of these, and we're not using all of them. So in a nutshell, that is how we've taken this incredible resource and tried to bring it down into Orleans-specific solutions.
I'll make it. Sia?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's nice and clear, but I wonder if you need a little focus on this thing so people can read the thing.
Okay, sure. How do you focus your computer? Did we try? I think it's got to focus on it, yeah.
All the slides are going to be posted on the website as we do with each.
It's going to get a lot clearer. I think these slides are really just sort of a laundry list.
Should be on your remote.
Is this my remote?
Point it at the machine.
Is that helping? That's focus. We're bringing in tech support. Oh, wait. We're trying to get a little bit of focus. It's hitting the focus. Maybe that works.
I just had my eyes examined this week, too. I think the problem is the beige and brown. Yeah, the colors.
They're too close colors.
Ta-da! Oh, there we go.
That's a little better.
You're back.
That's good.
That's better.
Yes.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I was not having trouble with it.
The colors are interesting, but I really think to be able to see visually with this number of people, just black on white is the best.
Really?
I know it's boring. Yeah. But really, you can see it.
Right. well, this was to differentiate sort of some general conversation from, I think, so we just talked about the list, the long list of possibilities and why we took from the matrix the specific non-traditional technologies that we did. I want to spend a couple of minutes putting these technologies in context and talking very soberly about what non-traditional technology solutions look like. And there are some real questions. These are questions that I have about non-traditional technologies. Things like, well, how do we know they work? And how well do they work? And what if they stop working? And I think Stacy came up with, what if they don't work as well as we think? This is where the rubber meets the road. And these are the questions that if we can't answer, we aren't being responsible at using these non-traditional technologies. And I'm the advocate for these.
What about cost? Have you started to look at that?
We are going to look at cost later. We are not looking. I look at that in the context of each technology, but it's a comparative question. So I'll get to that, and we will talk about it. Absolutely. So to answer these questions, there are two main vocabulary words. There are two main activities that actually get very close to answering, that do actually, I would say, answering these questions. One is monitoring, and the other is adaptive management. And if you've got these questions, especially how well do they work and do they work, the answer is monitoring. And that's probably too small a font, so I'm going to read it. It says, implementation of any non-traditional technology will require a rigorous monitoring plan with an approved quality assurance project plan, otherwise known as a QAP. And the point is, you have got to have a plan for how you're going to monitor these technologies. And it has to be a plan that has the parameters defined and the methodology for collecting those parameters defined. There is a technical review committee, I happen to be on it, that has been convened by the Cape Cod Commission to do just that. We're coming up with recommendations for each non-traditional technology. Hi, Tom. Tom is running that very important initiative. So we're coming up with recommendations for each of the technologies, and then talking about what would go into a QAP, this quality assurance plan, for the parameters, the frequency, the reporting requirements, the data analysis. What would you do if you had one of these technologies in place and you wanted to find out how it was doing and how well it was doing and whether it was performing the way you thought? As I've said, the sampling parameters are in the QAP, and the frequency and the duration. And so you've got not just some general idea about let's go out and monitor, but you've got pretty much, I mean, these QAPs are thick documents. You will see that even the instrumentation is specified. So you get a pretty good sense of the level of detail and rigor that the monitoring is going to have to go through. We've heard in other places that 3 years of data is going to be necessary to establish nitrogen reduction credit, so the TMDL credit for any technology, 3 years. But there's ongoing monitoring that's going to have to keep happening to make sure that the technologies are performing as they were intended. So what if they don't work as well as we think after they've gotten some sort of a TMDL figure? So at least 3 years. And a point about this that I think that Mike actually made that I thought was really important is that if you have different demonstrations, so you've got a PRB, you've got a bunch of eco-toilets, you've got a coastal habitat restoration project, and you've got some aquaculture going on, you're going to have a very complicated monitoring program. It is not an undoable monitoring program, but it is a real effort that is going to have to be managed with a high degree of rigor. And so what do you do with all this? So you've got all this data, you're collecting all this information, you've got these demonstrations, people are out there monitoring, you're getting your data quickly, you're being able to analyze it effectively, you're comparing apples to apples, you're seeing what's going on, And then you feed it into adaptive management. And that's the other, I would say, the other cornerstone of non-traditional technologies. Number one cornerstone is you've got to monitor these things really rigorously. The other is you have to take the information and act on it if you're not, if the systems aren't doing what you expect. So the adaptive management is the methodology where action is triggered if your monitoring is showing that things aren't working the way you expected. And so with that in place, that adaptive management, you have a trigger, an ongoing, an automatic kind of a system for dealing with risk. And the last thing I want to say about adaptive management is that this is going to be Orleans' adaptive management plan. That you yourselves are going to say we want annual review, we want twice-a-year review, we want 2-year review, so that it will be a plan that everyone is comfortable with the sequencing of. You want to say something about that?
Well, just in general, the environmental monitoring and the proof of efficacy is going to be needed for traditional solutions as well as non-traditional solutions. The state is going to put you through this for whatever solution you put up, because their test is, does it improve the habitats and the water quality in the water body? That's the bottom line. And you've got to do it whatever you do.
But we're talking about a little bit higher level of detail. That's monitoring the Sentinel station. What we're talking about here is monitoring the technology itself.
I don't think they're going to let you go on just monitoring the Sentinel station for nitrogen. They're going to require that you do environmental monitoring that's going to show the efficacy of this in terms of the improving water quality in the water body and restoring the habitat.
You also have to monitor your plants. I mean, the other thing is true is that if you've got a centralized...
Well, that's a given, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the equivalent of plant monitoring, but it's different because each non-traditional technology has a little bit different character.
I understand that.
We're talking about compliance monitoring. Compliance monitoring is something that we are also evaluating in the...
No, I'm not talking about compliance monitoring. I'm talking about...
in the water column, and make sure that the aquatic restoration goals are being met, not only in water quality as concentration, but also the habitat restoration,
Right.
all part of compliance monitoring. And what C is talking about is the monitoring for pilot projects or not.
I understand, but it's still an environmental monitoring program that you've got to implement.
So
Both work together.
we're clear, there's going to be monitoring no matter what technologies you use. But right now, we're just talking about the non-traditional.
I understand.
So one thing that's different about monitoring water quality or monitoring for a plant is that in year 4, you could have a huge storm that takes out your natural system. So part of my question is how that gets factored into your monitoring plan. And then related to that is with respect to adaptive management, if you make a change, does that mean you need another 3 years of data to measure your change to know if your adaptation is effective? So those are two things I'd like you to comment on, if you could.
Okay, the first comment is that not next meeting, but the meeting after, we're actually going to spend a whole meeting on adaptive management. And I think the answer to your question in a sentence or two is you will have to develop an adaptive management plan that addresses timeframes for change. So if you change your technology, you're going to have a decision about how much more you have to monitor. If you know you've done this much, you may need 2 years of monitoring versus if you change a whole entire system for the adaptive management. Now, catastrophic events, I'm going to talk about when I talk about the specific technologies, because that's a real concern, it's a real issue, and it's more than just having it in your adaptive management plan. You have to have it in your nitrogen removal calculations as well. So those are very accurate questions. The thing I also want to say about implementing non-traditional technologies, remember, I'm trying to give you a context for these technologies so that everybody understands that when we talk about non-traditional technologies, we're talking about ongoing monitoring, we're talking about an adaptive management plan that feeds back. And we're talking about non-traditional technologies are not easier than traditional technologies to use. I want to just put that out there. I want to sort of name that and say they're just different. They're not simpler. They're not necessarily more complicated, but they're certainly not less complicated. They're not easier, and you cannot implement effective non-traditional technologies without a good budget. These require funding. The monitoring requires funding. You have to have people involved in making these projects work. And you need people who are not only fully engaged, but competent. You know, to me, it's sort of the same thing. But you need to have people who are working on these projects who know what they're doing and who have their head in the game all the time, because they are real living systems. So it's key to implementing any of these. You cannot just leave them go away. You can't do that with a stormwater best management practice. You can't forget to maintain it, or it will stop working. And the other thing I want to point out in terms of big picture context is, you know, why would you bother? Like, what's the upside with these non-traditional technologies? And I think there are two really important ones. One is the speed of cleanup. I think one of the things that you can look at with non-traditional technologies and see is that if they work, they are working very quickly to clean up water bodies. You know, it's a very short time frame. And the other is if they are installed in the right places, if they're good projects, and you're not trying to shoehorn a non-traditional technology everywhere you possibly can, but you're picking the right locations, there's a very good chance that they're going to be cost competitive. They're going to be affordable solutions. And so that's the reason to take the next couple of hours and go through non-traditional technologies, because they certainly have a place, and some of them have a very high likelihood of proven success, and some of them are a little farther out in terms of what we know about them. But in general, the idea is the water cleanup is faster, and it might be cheaper. And that's why we're going forward in this vein. I'm going to apologize for these slides in advance. They break every rule of PowerPoint. I'm supposed to have white space. I'm not supposed to have a lot of words. You know, they're supposed to be legible. But they're none of those things, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to take each one and go into it in detail based on your criteria. You have some evaluation criteria. They were technical, they were economic, and they're social. And we went through each one of those criteria for each one of these technologies. And this is my filter. This is my perspective. And so I'm going to start out with stormwater. We're going to go through all the technologies that we've talked about today. And I'm going to share with you what I think in terms of how they meet your criteria. We're going to ask you then what I missed. And I actually added a separate set of criteria, which are the constraints and limitations. Because it wasn't an explicit criteria that you had in your points. But I think when I read between the lines of a lot of those points, it's really what people are asking, you know, what's wrong with all this. Can you guys read this at all?
No.
No and yes? All right. I'm going to try to focus it. I got to put it in the so now
Yeah, I don't think it's
I mean, the other thing I could do is pull it out of PowerPoint and try to make it bigger.
Yeah.
Do I want to bother, or do I just want to talk? I'll just talk through it. I'm just going to talk through it. So the first one, it says clear pathway. Your first technical criteria was, is there a clear pathway to implementation? And Mike gave you the clear pathway to implementation for stormwater already. Orleans is doing all the steps that are necessary. You're surveying your catchment areas, you're figuring out what best management practices to install, you're figuring out how much they cost. And the thing that, when I've looked at these stormwater systems, what we've seen is that if you install them as part of other public works projects, in other words, it's a marginal addition to another infrastructure improvement, they're a lot more affordable. And so the idea would be to try to understand where you can do these, where you're already doing other work in the area, because you're already mobilizing a crew. And that makes a pretty big difference to cost. So yes, I think there's a clear pathway to implementation. I think for all of these, there's a clear pathway to implementation. Is it flexible and adaptive? And in my head, I put neutral, because I don't think that stormwater adapts to bigger storm events than what you're getting, but it doesn't necessarily, it does capture the storm events that you're getting. So in my head, it was sort of neutral to that point. Is it environmentally sustainable? And so I have a very particular perspective on environmental sustainability, and it has to do with energy use, because I think low energy use is a really important factor in environmental sustainability. So because these are very low energy users, in fact, there's no energy use, I think that there's a big reason to call them environmentally sustainable. They also remediate rapidly. So from a sustainability perspective, as soon as you've installed your stormwater management strategy, you're starting to collect that volume of stormwater and that volume of nitrogen and phosphorus and pathogens. So there's a lot of benefit. The next one is, does it address short and long-term solutions? Once you install them, they will collect stormwater, but maintenance is required. So if that means you can install it and do nothing, the answer is no. But if it means you install these measures, the stormwater measures, and maintain them, will they keep doing their job? The answer is yes. It incorporates and understands risk. That is why I went through that entire slide on adaptive management and monitoring. The way to handle risk with these non-traditional solutions, and stormwater is one of them, is to have a good monitoring program that somebody's watching, that it feeds into a good adaptive management plan, and there are automatic triggers if the systems stop working. And so that is the risk mitigation strategy for non-traditional solutions. Is it based on best science and information? A couple of questions. I'm going to take questions at the end of the third slide. So we're asking about which BMPs and how do we know they work and how well they work. But there's a center at University of New Hampshire that has been actually running field experiments. It's sort of like the septic test center for stormwater. And they measure the influent, they measure the effluent, they put liners underneath so they know they're catching just what's going into the system. And they've documented the efficacy and the nitrogen removal for the measure. So gravel wetland does a great job of denitrifying and sequestering phosphorus. A vegetated swale does a terrific job of both of those things. When we were doing our site visit on Friday at Lonnie's Pond, there's a system called Stormtree, and Gary was able to find out from looking at data from UNH that it does remove 50% of the phosphorus and 77% of the total dissolved nitrogen by the numbers of what's going into it. So if you have a particular system, we're not going to be based on Mass DOT handbook, but Mass DEP has a handbook. And frankly, Mass DEP doesn't give credit lightly to some of these things. And so when you look at the test center and you look at Mass DEP's nitrogen removal and phosphorus removal values, I think that is very sound science to base nitrogen and phosphorus removal rates.
Just you missed reliable as you were going through them.
I did, okay. Well, I think I answered it in the vein of based on science. So if you're monitoring, they will reliably achieve the level that they're rated for. So you have to look at the technology that you've installed. You have to understand what it's rated for, and if you maintain it, it will do probably what it says. So now we've got economic and social and political. I said I apologize for these slides, but we want to. I want you guys to think about your criteria. That's why you took the time to create criteria and filter each of these technologies through. Does it support economic vitality for the town? When I looked at that particular criteria, and these are going to be the same for each one, so that's why I'm bringing them up. I thought that if Orleans can clean up its water quickly and get to a place where the nitrogen, the effects of nitrogen, the algae blooms and the odors and all that stuff, has reduced, that is the part of the reason for doing that. I think it was at the first meeting that I was here, we talked about all these things we love about Orleans, and then everybody said, well, property values. And everybody laughed. And I think the idea that you're keeping your water clean quickly is important to the economic vitality of the town. are stormwater practices affordable and sensitive to different social and economic situations? I would say yes, because you would fund them through the general fund. I think one of the issues about economic justice is that you're not making one group of people pay for something and not having it spread equally over the entire community. And as a infrastructure public works project, it would be spread over the whole community. Does it create jobs? Depends on how you implement it and who's monitoring. If you're going to add help to the DPW, it will create jobs. If you're going to make them do it on the budget you have, probably not. But again, it depends on how you maintain it. Is it perceived as, and is it a good value for the money? And that really depends. There are some projects that are probably very expensive. If you can put them on to existing public works projects, they may be very affordable, and then they will be a good value for the money. So again, it depends on the actual project. And does it maximize regional synergies and agreements? Clearly, if you're cleaning up a shared watershed and stormwater is part of it, you're having a shared watershed benefit. I think the other is that across the Cape, stormwater and fertilizer are being looked at as a way to get a percentage of the load, and so it's consistent with a regional approach to removing nitrogen by this criteria, or by this measure. And then political and social. Is it will it be publicly acceptable? I think nobody likes driving through puddles, so I think it will be acceptable. Does it comply with regulations? I think that's an easy yes. Is it consistent with planning and future vision for the town? I said feedback required, but based on Mike's research, I think it's pretty clear that the town is absolutely moving forward to try to identify good ways to handle your stormwater. Can we communicate to the public? Is it transparent? Yeah, and I think a field trip and a couple of pictures would go quite a long way to showing people how to handle stormwater. Does it promote an understanding of stewardship, an understanding of water as a resource? In some cases, I think it's a technology, and when you just install a technology, people forget about it, and it doesn't really educate people about the value of stormwater best management practices, or people in their septic systems. It's in the ground, and people sort of forget about them. So in that case, I don't think it's a huge benefit.
I just was going to say, they just installed a stormwater BMP system right outside my kids' elementary school. They also are using it as an educational tool for the kids.
Right.
So depending on how visible it is and where it is, there are potentially opportunities for stormwater to serve a educational or visual function.
Right. And then last but not least, is it a good value for the money? That came up twice. Clearly, you folks are interested in, are there cost issues here, and are they a good value, and do people think they're a good value? And again, it depends on the actual project. And this is the last slide where I came up with some constraints and limitations. One of the constraints and limitations that you're going to see with a number of these non-traditional solutions is the life cycle cost. So what does it cost to put it in? What does it cost to maintain it? How long, what's the longevity of these systems? So that's the life cycle cost. And then the maintenance cost. What does it really cost year after year to make sure that they're not clogging up and they're actually continuing to operate as designed? There is the money that goes into monitoring and watching if we have to continue to look at stormwater influent and outflow. There is a practical question, which is you have your catchment areas, and you've got sometimes you've got pipes going, direct discharge. Sometimes you have manholes or catch basins. What can you really install in terms of a system that will reduce nitrogen and phosphorus? So that's really the next question that you guys are really well underway in terms of answering. How many of these BMPs can we put in? What are they going to cost? And how much nitrogen are we really going to get at the end of the day? And that's the next real step here, but it is a constraint. It's not going to work everywhere. And again, I say the town is in the process of cataloging the stormwater that's currently installed and trying to figure out what to do about it, and thinking about what the real number is. The MEP has a number for stormwater, and we're looking at what the real number is based on the contracts you have out right now so we'll be able to answer. And now we're going to take questions and comments, and I hope Scott has something to add.
Yes, I just want to add a couple quick things. One is EPA came out with their draft stormwater permit last week, finally. And that's going to direct towns, including Orleans, to address a number of the stormwater problems. And somebody said before, questioning about the cost of this. I think one way to look at this is, as you've already done from the earlier slides, the town's already heavily invested in the stormwater management program. And I would suggest looking at the incremental cost of tweaking that, whatever they're doing now, which is primarily pathogen management, nitrogen management might be the real cost of nitrogen management rather than taking the whole cost.
Right.
Because that's being done. It's being done through another regulatory program. I just suggest that maybe that's a consideration that might make this a lot more sort of cost effective looking at it. And I also want to reinforce your point is when you build these projects as part of another DPW project, the cost is drastically less than starting from scratch and going in and doing an intervention. So I think if they're planned properly, they can be quite cost effective. If you start from scratch and say you want to build a retrofit, rip up the road, it's going to be very expensive, and I don't know too many people recommending doing projects that way these days.
Yeah, I think the piggybacking is a good way to go. Sims.
In your first slide, you had maintenance concerns under the long and short term. Short-term solutions. It needs to figure substantially in the sustainability, because energy use, there's a lot of equipment to clean out a passive or a gravity-actuated system. You're using up energy for the maintenance, both resources and labor. And also under the reliability. If there are certain areas that are prone to more silt-infiltrated runoff, not only does it require more frequent maintenance, but the reliability of that system, because you have to monitor the degree that the siltation may be occurring, you're going to have reduced efficacy, which reduces the reliability of the system.
Okay, so we're going to modify
I need to see maintenance in more places, because it really, it's a major it's a major consideration, and for those of us.
Number 3 bullet, there it is.
But it's, when you mention it up front, it just, I think it needs to be in several places, and I know my colleague to my far right here would be raising the cost of maintenance questions, because it's part of every budget that we go through.
And it's a real cost?
Yeah, and the cost of maintenance on these, I mean, I think, and Judy Scanlon would know better, so Judy, jump in if I'm saying this wrong, but the system at Lonnie's, I think, has been in for 20 years. As far as I know, it has never been monitored, it has never been maintained. We spent a very long time trying to figure out how on earth and where you could get this thing checked and monitored, where the portals were for all the systems in town. That was all volunteer time. It is going to be a huge amount of town staff time to try to figure out how to get into these systems and monitor them ongoing and maintain them. I mean, you don't put them in the ground and walk away, which is what the few that Orleans has, that's what we've done. I'm not being critical, because I think the town's done a great job of trying to fix and improve our stormwater, but frankly, it has all been focused on trying to get rid of pathogens and trying to get rid of sediments and hydrocarbons. Almost nothing's been done on nutrient removal, and in terms of little bits of extra cost, it's not little bits of extra cost, where you have huge amounts of water going into a low spot that goes into a pond, because that's where they're all focused to. It's a huge amount of water. It needs a huge amount of land if you're talking a vegetated swale. This is a developed town. You don't have all of these pieces of land sitting on your waterfront just waiting for a vegetated swale to go in in order to take up these nutrients. So I'm not trying to be negative, but this is not reality that we're looking at here for where we are in Orleans in terms of what we need to do. And all the costs that were presented, we've spent a tremendous amount of money, and I would spend those dollars again in a heartbeat. It's the right thing to do. We've done great with stormwater. But it doesn't in any way have anything to do with the nutrient removal that's going to be required going forward for part of the TMDS.
Okay,
To try to say that this is money that's been spent and therefore we're a great way down the road on stormwater.
Well,
Let me,
I think you're right, and I wasn't trying to say that you've already done the nutrient remediation.
I guess I was getting that from Mike Domenica's presentation earlier.
And I don't think Mike was saying.
I'm picking on you, Mike.
Oh, this is what I would say. So what's the pathway? I want to go back to what's the pathway to implementation? Because that to me is a really, what you're saying is the pathway is not as clear. And what I say here is we're going the surveying the catchment areas and designing a management system that actually does remove nitrogen and phosphorus and planning that into infrastructure projects that are already going on is how you would implement it. I don't think either of us were saying that you've already implemented it.
Okay, thank you.
I think a first step is to say, what's the load? You know, we want to get, I looked at stormwater in Falmouth, and there was not a huge bang for the buck for the particular watershed that I was looking for, because there were so many individual, tiny discharges. And so with this survey that's being done, what we as planners can do is actually start looking at where does it make sense. It may not make sense everywhere. And so the idea that you could have you have a stormwater load, you might be able to get 25% of it is an analysis that needs to be done. And the steps for getting to that analysis have to do with surveying what you've got and seeing with this particular system that's at Lonnie's, we're going to talk about it later, if we could take a look at that and upgrade it, and it could remove phosphorus and nitrogen because it's designed to, if it would be easy, you know, to figure that out, it certainly would be worth doing. But again, we got to take it the next step.
And I do want to clarify, I'm not being critical of DPW because Tom Daly has done a fabulous job since he arrived in looking at literally every single possible stormwater area to try to figure out where some kind of nutrient reduction can be implemented. He's just been outstanding at that.
We're going to take it the next level.
And yeah, and just so keep in mind, remember, we're still up, we're talking in theory, and we're going to get into very specifics. Where are you going to put these things? So we will go there today.
I just wanted to add, with respect to that particular treatment system, which is on Herringbrook Road, the town does do some maintenance on it, but it's not, and I know there's been attempts in the past to try to replant the vegetation that's supposed to be there, but it hasn't been an ongoing program. I don't even know if we have the maintenance, you know, from the company and, you know, any specifics. I know there's no sampling port, so you can't determine, that's always been a complaint of mine, you can't determine if it's working effectively because you don't know what's coming in and going out. But I saw that Sia had, that's on her list, you know, monitoring and everything is there. So I think in the future when we do something like this, if we do, I think it's addressed.
If the town decides to take stormwater credit, see slide number 3, right? Monitoring adaptive management. We got to go there.
Sia, who's going to do that study that you just, looking at all these things and figuring out what we should do and where we should do it and how much it's going to cost? Is that part of this contract?
No, it's not. It's the town's stormwater management master plan, that $500,000 we talked about, plus the annual implementation, is the primary vehicle. Our plan is to incorporate that into the revised CWP to the degree that it assists with phosphorus, nitrogen, and water quality improvement under the revised CWP. Just to make a point, so I didn't miscommunicate, the slides I showed up front are what the town has done and is doing. But if you notice that, there's very little implementation. There's a few projects around, but the one I did quote, the Uncle Israel's Pond, which I thought was going to go, the actual cost benefit analysis of that came out to where it was about $500,000 to build this system that caught a very low volume of nitrogen. When you think about it, except this has been pointed out, if it's part of another project, that's okay. But when you go in to put in one of these systems, it's a relatively high capital expense.
long-term operation and maintenance expense. And the action, if you think about it, the commission's saying you get 25% of the stormwater load. And Tom, what's the stormwater load from a typical watershed? What percent?
Yeah, it's less than 10%.
Less than 10%, I've heard somewhere between 5 and 8%. So you're getting 25% of 7%, maybe, at a very high capital cost. So when we put it into a cost effectiveness thing, that's when the rubber hits the road. And just one more comment, that's why prioritization is critical, because a lot of this is driven by impervious area. So if you have big impervious areas, other projects, stuff like that, then it may be cost effective in that very specific site. But in general, stormwater management is not going to get you a big bang for the buck in terms of your nitrogen or phosphorus reduction.
As a point of clarification, that $500,000 that has been allocated for a master plan, a very significant portion of that, on the order of half of it, is for implementation. So it's about 225, 250 of research and development of the master plan, and a similar amount, the balance, whichever way it falls, is for construction of remediation. And because it's bonded, it's available over a number of years. It's not a specific budget year item.
And you're also putting in $150,000 as
Over
a
and
capital
above.
investment as well.
And so what you'd want to do is when we get to the sub-watersheds, you want to say, okay, is there, after we've got all this on the GIS, and we can look at what's going on a sub-watershed basis. You'd say, this sub-watershed has this storm drain. Lonnie's might be the perfect example. It's a small, incremental amount of stormwater that this system might, I'd have to look at the catchment area, but that is part of what the CWMP update is going to do. Is I think we're going to look at where we can try to get the stormwater reductions with either existing systems that just need to be upgraded or new systems that there's some money to implement. But it's not going to be everywhere all the time, and that's why bullet number 4 is the practical implementation is a constraint and a limitation.
Sandy? Can I mention a couple of
Hang on,
points?
Sandy, sorry, Sandy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is really for Stacy and Mike and the panel more than for Stantec. We have, I think, have a consensus that we need in Orleans to include in Eastham to include freshwater ponds in the discussion. And you have mentioned that in some cases it's called out, in some cases it seems to be not part of the discussion. Some system may be reviewed for nitrogen only and not for phosphorus. In some cases you've mentioned both. So I'm just wondering, do we need to, am I missing something, or do we need to reassess that and enforce that?
So I think for each technology, we should be saying both nitrogen and phosphorus to the extent of what it works for.
What it works for.
Yeah, and this
Not
one,
all technologies.
Right.
and this one did have both.
Right.
So it's the first
But
one.
yes, let's make sure that we are, if you see us miss that.
Remind us.
Okay.
We're trying to be sensitive to
Cheryl, and then.
I mean, picking up on Mike's comments a moment ago, I mean, it seems to me that we're actually talking about much less than 25%, because you're looking at the applicability of a small number of technologies. I recall that matrix from the University of New Hampshire, the small number of technologies that have a high level of nitrogen removal, then you have to figure out where they'll fit in town, and then if we're going with the incremental approach, you're only pursuing projects that are going to be upgraded anyway. And so that's really a very small number of projects and affecting a very small volume of stormwater.
But it may be the nitrogen removal in a sub-watershed that gets you to arithmetically, it may be very important to include it. So I would say it may be more than 25% for a particular installation in a particular sub-watershed. And it may be nothing in a different sub-watershed where it's just not feasible. So it's really, these are very site-specific, and that's why this afternoon, before you all leave and go home to dinner, we're going to go through each sub-watershed and see where we think we can actually do this. Because stormwater isn't a non-traditional technology. It's a very traditional technology that answering this question about stormwater works for both scenarios because it's a load that's being reduced with this technique. I just happen to get to talk about it. And we're gonna need to move on because we've got 10 of these.
Yeah, so we're gonna have to think about how we go through them.
All right. That's a good idea.
I just want to make sure Ed gets his.
That's okay, I'll wait.
Okay. And you, Pressy?
I was just going to quickly say to Sandy, I'm quite certain we're looking at phosphorus as well as nitrogen in terms of all the stormwater reviews that are being done in town.
Yeah.
So that would be, and for Uncle Israel's, there is in fact a very nice natural vegetative swale that's doing a good job on stormwater off Aunt Abigail's. Might be worth it to the town to measure that water and actually get some credit for it. It exists, it's working, it's there.
Okay, great. Marissa, go ahead.
What
do you want to do?
I just want to say because of time.
Absolutely.
And we have like super well thought out slides on all of these technologies, but we're not going to get through them all and get to the subwatersheds. So just want to check in with you all. Here's one proposal, and that is that we skip to the limitations issue, the third slide. Not that we want to skip all the good stuff, but you can sort of summarize the good stuff and then get into the what do we have to work, what's their big concerns, considerations.
I'm good with that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Can people live with that? And then we open it for questions. And remember, we'll get into the site-specific.
And the other thing that will work really well, because I know you guys are so good about your homework, is the slides are going to get posted and you're going to have copies of them. And so you can read my perspective on your, on your criteria. And you can comment back to Stacy, the way Sims did, that maintenance ought to be in there more, and that kind of stuff on the technical, economic, and social criteria. So I'm fine with that, and if you guys can read them as easily as I can. So fertilizer, I think the seminal point with fertilizer is the town has already adopted a bylaw, and the town is also updating its fertilizer study. So the real numbers for fertilizer load are going to be known. And when you really know what your fertilizer load is, and you know that within 100 feet of your resources it's prohibited, you can do some very apt calculations for how much nitrogen people are now not putting on their lawns because of fertilizer. So you can look at how I filtered your criteria. And I think that this is a courtesy of a site field trip that we took on Friday. That's one of Judy's great pictures. That's a lawn that's nice and green right on a pond. So what are the take-home constraints and limitations with the fertilizer bylaw is it depends on individual compliance. I believe very strongly that lawn care professionals and companies are going to follow the law. They are demonstrating that they want to. On a regional level, as more and more towns have bylaws, it's going to be a lot easier for lawn care companies to be able to manage their practices in a way that complies with the law. So there is a great regional synergy with the fertilizer bylaw. But from the residential perspective, without ongoing education and enforcement and a real commitment to helping people understand that what they're putting on their lawn right next to the water, a lot of it's probably going into that water and causing the algae blooms, you're not going to get as much compliance. So with that, I'm just going to open it up to your thoughts on fertilizer.
I think it's my only comment, at least from a voting point of view of the town. I think educational regulations are one thing, and enforcement is another. And I think the enforcement argument will be more difficult as we go down the road. There may be much more pushback on that particular issue.
Okay.
Just reality.
Okay.
What about a cranberry bog?
The cranberry bogs are exempt. It's agriculture.
I believe there are also regulations that govern cranberry growers and what they are allowed to put on their crop. And there's also a huge amount of data through the cranberry station in Wareham about the impacts of over-fertilization on plants. Scares me to know this stuff.
Been at it 2 months, so.
And what about saltwater marshes? Are they,
So your bylaw prohibits fertilizer from being applied within 100 feet of a resource area, and a saltwater marsh is considered a resource area.
What kind of enforcement is there for example, my brother-in-law lives in Yarmouth, and he's right beside that great big cranberry bog, which is on Route 6, on the right-hand side as you're going to Boston. You've all seen it, I'm sure. And they have an outfall pipe that empties, not about half a mile from where he lives, and he says the water there is terrible. It's full of algae and everything. So I don't know what the enforcement is about. Somebody said there was enforcement required.
On topic?
Yeah, it was mentioned before, but cranberry growers don't over-fertilize because nitrogen in particular is a negative on growing cranberries. If you overdo it on nitrogen, you get less yield out of the bog. So they're not gaily throwing nitrogen fertilizer on cranberry bogs.
Well, that's a motivation, but the practice is not. That's not what the practice is, because there's a very good demonstration of how it isn't being enforced.
There's only a couple of towns that have fertilizer bylaws.
Not talking about cranberry bogs.
Patty was just talking about cranberry bogs.
Yeah.
He is talking.
Yes.
I was just going to mention that we've been, because we have a pond with 2 bogs that actually abut it, and there have been some issues with it. A lot of the issues with water quality are historical, that deal with past practices and regeneration. The other thing is we've talked some about being able to create a wider or an alternative outfall to be able to catch and absorb some of the nitrogen and phosphorus before it actually hits the pond.
We're actually going to see a cranberry bog when we talk about our specifics.
But if the state, Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources does promulgate the regs, it's been talking about promulgating, they will require sellers of fertilizer to have signage that says there is no phosphorus needed for new lawns. You only can buy this basically, for old lawns. You can only buy this basically for starter lawns. And they will have the kinds of phosphorus fertilizers separated with all that education as part of it. So in some ways, they'll be requiring the sellers to do part of the education, which is very helpful, I think.
And again, it's the educational value of your bylaw. I wouldn't discount it. I think it's a very, very important public awareness, and if people want their estuaries clean, it's a very inexpensive thing to do, and to actually piggyback on that is a worthwhile event. So we're going to move on to fertigation. And fertigation, we talked about last time, is the idea that you're using irrigated water you're using pumped water that's got nitrogen in it to fertilize your field. I think one of the main constraints is how many locations you can actually find. And when we talk about some of the traditional solutions and the water reuse, we're also going to be looking at this idea of where can you take this nutrient-rich water and use it to benefit growing of turf or something else. There's only one location, the ball fields, that we've identified so far in Orleans, and then we found out that you're already doing something there. So this isn't a huge player in our non-traditional scenarios, so I was going to kind of move on from there.
One other thing with that too is, what do you do with it in the winter? Ground's frozen. Where do you take it? Do you store it?
You don't pump it up. It's only. I mean,
you're producing it year round.
Sure, and that's sort of a cost problem for a different day. You have to store it, obviously. But in this case,
you do have a coincident cycle here of increased population flow in the summer and the growing season, so there's some of that.
but you also have to make sure, I think if you're applying fertilizer, you can at least take the credit for the fertilizer you're not applying. But if you're not applying fertilizer and you're then using fertigation, you really do have to figure out how you would figure out what the plants are actually uptaking. So it gets a little complicated. But again, it's not such a big rock that I want to take too much time on it today. But PRBs, I am going to take a little bit of extra time on because they are what I would call a big rock in the non-traditional scenarios. And I want to say a couple of things. One is that the way to implement the permeable reactive barriers is to do some ground truthing. We've actually been able to figure out quite a bit. We've been able to figure out depth to groundwater. We drove by the roads and sort of verified some of the elevations. There have been irrigation wells dug in a couple of the roads, so we even know some of the constituents of the soil and stratigraphy and groundwater nutrient chemistry. But what you really need to do to get to the next level, I mean, I've brought you to 500 feet, but to get to the ground, we're going to have to actually install some wells. And fortunately, Stantec has some great background experience. They have a whole team and a whole division that does this kind of work, as do a number of the other good engineering companies. What you have to do is go in and specifically look at the stratigraphy, the geohydrology, the depth to groundwater, the thickness of the aquifer, and a bunch of other factors before you know exactly what nitrogen removal rate you're going to get. It depends on the chemistry. They do a thing called a treatability study. And a treatability study looks at the soils and the actual groundwater constituents and the chemistry and says, this is, if we put different media in, this is what we get. And I think the second main point, see I'm trying to rush, I'm forgetting stuff, but the second main point is these are not trenches in beaches. We're really talking about installing either wells, if it has to go deep, or trenches, and it looks like we've got some shallow areas where trenches might work, in road layouts and on public land. We want to avoid going into wetlands areas pretty much at all cost. And we want to get back onto roads. Okay, so you missed those last couple of houses that are right on the water, but I think from an environmental perspective and from a permitting perspective, you're going to do a lot better if you keep these in the road layout. And that's in the, I have selection criteria and in that big report that I sent you, and I highlight that. There is the other main thing I want to say about permeable barriers, the kind that I'm talking about, so either the injection wells or the trenches and roadways, is this is taking an established, mature technology and applying it to groundwater. So remediation of groundwater using the interception of those groundwater plumes with chemistry has been going on for decades. We're just taking that technology and using it for nitrogen because it hasn't been highly practiced specifically for nitrogen. There's not a huge body of data, but there's some. There have been two very good literature studies. One CDM Smith did for Falmouth, and the other, there's a bunch in the technology matrix. So the idea is there's absolutely information that gives you a range of removal. That's the 70 to 90. And in Falmouth, we looked at about 80%. If you intercept the groundwater, 80% of the nitrogen that's in it is going to get removed, and it's quick. You're not waiting for travel time. You're doing it as the groundwater moves. So those are some sort of, in a nutshell, key features and realities of permeable reactive barriers. And that
just for the PRB at Shumat Pond, I think we mentioned this in Falmouth, is a phosphorus PRB.
Yes.
It has about 15 years of its data.
And that goes to the point of, is it flexible and adaptive? One of the things about PRBs is if you install them and you have, perforated pipe for injecting media, or injection wells where you're injecting media, you can actually tailor what you're injecting to evolving environmental concerns. So if maybe contaminants of emerging concern become a problem, you can start looking at using different media to address those things. And certainly phosphorus, which is the main point, is able to be remediated if that becomes an issue. The questions about PRBs are, there are life cycle costs. What are the reinjection rates? That's a really big question. In many ways, these are an easy, if you're digging a trench and you put the media in and it lasts 25 years, you sort of, know what you're into. But with if you're injecting a fluid, that treatability study, which is that next level of analysis, will tell you but you have to get to that level of analysis before you know. Monitoring costs, I think right now we're looking at the Lamborghini of monitoring. I mean, if we could monitor whatever we wanted to, it would be a very expensive monitoring program. But the idea is, can we figure out a Ford? Can we figure out a good monitoring program that isn't going to break the bank and still make sure we know that we're not getting groundwater going around our barrier or under our barrier and it's working? And then there's the practical constraints. You can't put these everywhere. And so I think where you can put them, they will be good ideas, but there's lots of places where you can't. And these are just some examples of the kinds of systems that people are actually putting in. And you can see this when you're looking at it on your computer. Okay, so questions about PRBs. I'm very sensitive to time right now, sorry. Yes.
On page 8 of your 25-page paper that we got in advance, it talks about the radius of influence and the distance between 20-25. What does a well look like? I mean, what actually is it?
See this picture over here?
I can't.
This guy right here. It looks like nothing. So the idea is you're putting a well in the ground, and you've got a little cover that sits on top of it. That's what you're looking at.
So, but then into that well, you inject vegetable oil. How do you know that vegetable oil isn't going to move through the sandy soils and end up in the resource?
That is a great question. It's not always vegetable oil. There's a range of
whatever. I mean, there were some
liquid.
serious downsides to the wood chips in Falmouth. So how do we know if we? I mean, that's great that we're not using wood chip trenches.
Down gradient in a beach area where they got salt water, and Tom can talk more about what went wrong in Falmouth. The treatability study is a very important ground verification, validating. It determines the feasibility of if this works. So what the treatability study does is it looks at the soils, and it looks at the media that you install, and it looks at what happens down gradient with oxidation and reduction and manganese and iron and all the other constituents that are potentially in the soil, and it decides how far back do you need to be to allow recombination of the chemistry in the ground so that you don't get this, what's called daylighting of different constituents that you don't really want to see. So it becomes a very detailed analysis of the particular conditions of the soil that avoids those kind of problems. And you can, when you know your soils and you know the viscosity of the fluid that you're injecting, your radius of influence can be pretty well defined. And that's where you would avoid this daylighting issue of the fluid itself, but also that recombination of when the groundwater changes its chemistry.
And I would say also the oils are strongly adhered to the soils that they're put into. And so that's why when you look at cleanup sites of petroleum hydrocarbons, sometimes they go on for decades and decades because they cannot get rid of the oil that's adhered onto the soils.
I'm concerned about the pond, frankly. I gotta tell
We don't
you.
want it to hit the pond.
You know, we inject all this oil
is not
into
going to
the
be
soil.
moving really fast through the aquifer. So that's a good thing, and then, but then it's another thing to contend with because you want to increase the size of your radius as well. So as you're pushing that through, you want to increase that size and push it through the aquifer, but then you don't want it to naturally migrate.
Okay, and where you have a viscous material, and you've got very sandy soils that are very permeable, water always follows the easiest route.
And it won't go there.
Why doesn't it just go around?
So the EVO, the emulsified vegetable, is more like the consistency of skim milk. It's not an oil. I mean, I've actually seen it. It's very much a milky substance.
I'd appreciate I think this is a very important discussion. I appreciate your thoughts on this because I think this is one of the big issues. Typically, these facilities, PRVs, have been used when you have dioxins or something moving through the groundwater because it's remediation of a severe pollution problem. It's toxic, so they're tolerable. But if you saw the Times this morning, the nurses that didn't want to get the flu shot, I think we have a similar thing here. The question I have is, will people tolerate injecting anything into the groundwater that
so based on a very fine-tuned technical argument that it's going to work? Do we have that much trust in the analysis and technology and everything to where we say, this isn't a worry, go ahead and inject whatever it is in the ground when you have a beach there and other issues? And groundwater has always been a very valuable, resource to us. Notwithstanding, we put nitrogen into it, but at the same time, will this be tolerable even if we could prove that technically it's feasible? And I don't know the answer to that.
And I think it's very exciting from the standpoint of possibly being able to remove the nitrogen as well as some of these contaminants of emerging concern. I mean, from that standpoint, I think this is a hugely positive, possible technology. But the other side of me says, first do no harm. And here we have this problem, which is nitrogen. And to fix this problem, we inject all of this whatever substance, and then that goes through the soil and ends up in our salt ponds, in our ACEC, either of our ACECs or the Town Cove Nauset. That's a very, I would really need to know that this is not going to happen, that this is safe, that we're not going to be turning around to our town citizens 10 years from now and explaining to them why we destroyed 3 of the terminal ponds in town.
And you'd probably want to start with a couple of, you'd want to start out really incrementally.
Yeah, even that incremental,
Okay.
I'm guessing the abutters to that first incremental pond are not going to be wildly enthusiastic over being the guinea pigs as to whether their pond is destroyed.
As I listen to you talk about this and the questions that some of us sitting around are raising in our mind, and when you talk about you have to do lab experiments to see if the soil and the water and everything's right and you're not sure where the hydrocarbons are going, it reminds me of lab experiments that we used to do in commercial settings. And what was done in the lab wasn't exactly, and sometimes far off from what really happened in the real world. What I hear is, this is not a proven technology that would give us a comfort level of it being sound in this particular application. And I'm familiar with it, by the way, in Superfund sites. It's a big deal in Superfund sites. But it doesn't sound like there's an equivalent, proven, long-term operation for this kind of technology, which is, to me, is very attractive as an engineer, by the way. But I don't sense that from what you're telling me.
I think if I could see it,
Sure.
As you mentioned, this is kind of almost off-the-shelf technology for Superfund sites and hazardous waste sites, 21E sites. That is one of the tools in the toolbox for a remedial engineer or remedial hydrogeologist. And so its application here, we have seen some applications, and I think also up in in Hannaford they did a huge PRB that was dealing with it was a co-contaminant, but there was a high nitrogen value in it as well. And they did exactly this with a carbon source PRB that was able to reduce the nitrogen. So I think there's evidence that shows that this could be an excellent technology to try to do. We do need to pilot it, though. It needs to be piloted.
And there are and the idea of a treatability study, I'm just trying to be honest about there's not one size fits all, but the idea that, the top 10 engineering firms in the country have these treatability labs and regularly go through this as part of remediating everything from perchlorate to, other things.
But we're talking about nitrogen. We're talking about a specific environment, and you're not telling me there's many cases of this environment being proven over a long period of time.
So,
I'm just saying I
okay,
hear a risk.
That's important.
I hear a risk involved in this.
And I think that the difference, too, to me, is where you're talking about a Shumat Pond, where you had this huge plume of phosphates moving towards it, with nothing else to do, really. There was no choice. You can't stop it, and it's going to the pond, and if it reaches the pond is toast. That, to me, is a real reason to put in a PRB.
You had no other option.
No other option. Right? And the same, maybe if this is found to be effective in doing 1,4-dioxane, I don't know, we asked up in Eastham, and they said no. that these PRBs are not effective for that particular thing. But where you have it moving down from a landfill, a capped landfill, into Salt Pond, eventually getting to Town Cove and Nauset Marsh, that's really compelling. I mean, that then you say, okay, how else are we going to get rid of this? Is there any other way? It might be of use. But when I look at something like nitrogen, I'm not saying it's not bad stuff, but I'm just saying that the cure may well be much worse than the disease. So I just think we need to be very cautious about this.
You talk about the life cycle costs. I heard there was an issue with the predictability of the cost in Falmouth, in that the cost wound up to be substantially higher than the original projections. Is that another variable that we have to look at?
I don't think that's accurate. I think what happened in Falmouth is the monitoring costs were higher than we expected. That was what happened in Falmouth.
I wasn't really distinguishing between life cycle monitoring costs, but if we go and we make a decision to try this based upon certain cost projections, is there another risk factor that says it's, and I've worked on a lot of projects where honestly our actual costs are a lot higher than our projected costs. Are we facing a situation with here where we might project it's going to cost $1 million and it costs several $1 million?
I mean, if we have enough data points from other projects, then we can run a probability simulation that would tell us with what degree of probability.
Well, that doesn't sound like we're going to get that, but I'm saying what happened in Falmouth?
The installation costs, we weren't expecting anything. We asked the consultants to tell us what it was going to cost to implement and monitor.
Okay.
And I think what happened is we were surprised by the monitoring costs that came back. That's really what happened. It's not like we had projected and then actual, because we were just asking for the projected. And I think if we took the step of doing the field work that I described, then I think you could be pretty confident that when the costs come back after, that level of analysis, they're going to be pretty good.
See, it might be helpful too, if we could hear maybe from an expert who's actually done it and knows the science and knows the application. Bring him here and let him, because if this becomes a fear, we need some expert opinions, I think, on something like this.
Well, maybe what I'll offer is that the EPA actually held a workshop a few months ago that I went to, and a couple of experts in the field were actually there. And one is a company out of Plymouth that does remediation of groundwater plumes, particularly for gas, so gas tanks that have. So he's got a pretty handy business doing gas tank work, and he talked about a couple of remediation projects that are recently being completed, and exactly walked through. You do a treatability study, you understand your hydrogeology and your stratigraphy, and it worked, and it cleaned things up, and it was in a site. These two sites that he talked about were actually residential areas. So, I can give you that information, but I think
the other thing we have there is Stantec. Joe Nicoloro with Stantec is probably one of these national experts in this kind of thing. He's done a lot of these types of things for all sorts of constituents. So I think that's very reasonable suggestion for someplace maybe in that technical workshop we have on December 3rd to have a focus section, session on this kind of issue. And we'll be following up on that as we go forward, because all of these are going to be site-specific. There's going to be particular places where stormwater may work. Most places it won't. Other places PRB may work. So very site-specific. But we can dig and drill down into this in more detail as we go forward.
I think I just also want to name that there is the conversation about convincing all of you with an expert that you feel like, okay, I feel that it's safe enough. I think it's worth us doing that kind of thing. That's one conversation. And the separate conversation of, can we convince everybody else? Right? So even if you all decided hearing all, doing the real work and research and digging into the fact, right? That's one piece of it, but one of the criteria was about, is this gonna be the kind of thing we can sell to the public, right? And to keep that in mind. I'm gonna get to you, but Judy has been waiting. And then after we finish this short conversation on PRVs, we're gonna take our break, and then we'll come back to the next technologies.
Thank you. See, I know that PRBs are designed to filter groundwater as it's traveling through. But I'm curious, I didn't know that PRBs could be installed as deep as I guess they can be installed, like up to 100 feet deep. And so I started to wonder if the media ever got clogged, could it actually change the groundwater flow in a particular area? Because water likes to travel the path of least resistance. Could you actually deprive, let's say, a kettle pond or wetland from the groundwater that it needs with a PRB? Do they have a negative side as far as groundwater flow direction?
Everything I know as a hydrogeologist would say, no, it wouldn't happen.
It would almost appear from an electrical designer's point of view that it would be less resistance than the soil through which it passes.
Could be, unless it got clogged. That was, I was wondering.
Yeah, I'm thinking clogging, not so much, but.
No.
I was just going to suggest that if we do have a workshop on this, you bring in an expert, that this would be the kind of thing that I think would be excellent to be an outside workshop open to the public. Doesn't have to be
Yes.
part of this forum. Put
PRB
it at the
101.
library and let any of the public who's interested in knowing more about PRBs, including all of us, attend it and learn more.
With that, I'd like us to take a break. 15 minutes, we'll come back, we'll hear about
The rest of it.
the rest sort of in abstract, and then we'll